I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. Thank you for coming this morning. This is the third in our series on threats to national security with specific focus on influence operations, foreign disinformation, in U.S. affairs and our national, which affects our national security. We'll be featuring Adam Ronsley, who is an FPRI fellow and an expert on this topic, has written extensively. Our moderator this morning will be Aaron Stein. Dr. Aaron Stein is the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's also the Director of our Middle East program and the Acting Director of our National Security program as well. Aaron is a stranger to, I assume, none of you. He writes extensively. He's also the host of our podcast, The Middle East Brief, as well as War on the Rocks podcast, Arms Control Wonk. So this is a topic that is near and dear to me. My first day on the job was January 1st, 2020, and I thought it was a holiday, but about mid-morning I got a phone call saying that there was something odd going on, and it turned out that what we later found out was the Iranians had spoofed our website. I produced a website with a slightly different web address that looked exactly like the FPRI website, except the article, of course, was disinformation. And if you clicked on any of the links on that page, it drove you to our real website. So we actually got some new attention, which was one of the silver linings in all of that. I would also say that this is the third of a three-part series, and if you missed the first two, you can see them on our FPRI YouTube channel or find them on our website as well. You can find links to those. And the first one, as those of you who are here will recall, was Clint Watts speaking about his FIE 2020 project, looking at foreign influence in our 2020 election, tracking primarily Russian, Chinese, and Iranian disinformation. The second in the series was Daniel Hoffman, former senior CIA official and Russia expert, talking about Russian and China, what I would call covert action, or the Russians would call active measures, disinformation and influence operations. And this morning, as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on another actor in this area, and that's Iran. So let me turn it over to Aaron at this point to introduce our speaker today. But before I do, I want to say a special thank you to our sponsors, our donors, our partners, and our board members, who I see a few at least on this call this morning. And also for those of you who aren't members, encourage you to consider becoming a member. We can't do this without your support. We're incredibly grateful to all of you who do support us, and encourage those of you who value what we do to consider supporting us as well. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Aaron.
Well, thanks, Raleigh, and Adam, thanks for joining us this morning. And for those who don't know Adam, as Raleigh said, Adam is a reporter at the Daily Beast and also a fellow in the National Security Program at FPRI. Adam and I have known each other for a while now, and we share a lot of mutual interests, both in Iranian activities in the Middle East, and Adam is also always very kind to answer my questions when I have about specific things like Iranian-linked disinformation or anything technical. And so when I got a WhatsApp message on January 1st from a colleague or a friend who works at the American University in Iraq saying, Aaron, how in the world did you allow such an inflammatory article to make it past your editorial process and show up on your website about Iraq? To which I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I see most of the articles about the Middle East. It's possible we made a mistake, only to figure out that clearly somebody had been doing nefarious activity. The first person I talked to was Adam. The second I talked to was Clint, and I think Raleigh and I had a few conversations that day as well. So Adam has done a lot of work on this. It's not just about the FPRI website, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that he can discuss. And so with that, Adam, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and lead the discussion. Before you do, I forgot to mention, once Adam is finished, I will be collecting questions at the bottom. You will see a Q&A function. Type those in there. I will be moderating and curating, and then we will have a discussion after the presentation that will end somewhere between 11 and 11:15, depending on the amount of questions. And as I always say, the events I moderate end on time. So with that, Adam, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks a lot. You can hear me? I'm good? No technical issues? Great. Let's take a look at what happened on New Year's Day. I got a call, a little bit worse for wear, from Aaron. And if you looked on what appeared to be the FPRI website, you would see an article, Revolution or Political Crisis in Iraq. It was written in Arabic. It was a fake op-ed by a very real FPRI fellow, Richard D. Hooker, who's former NSC staff, NDU professor. And the narrative, you can see it over there on the left. The narrative of the article was essentially that Richard Hooker is telling his audience that the invasion of Iraq has not served U.S. interests particularly well, and that there's too much power in the hands of Iraq Shia bloc. And so he recently had a conversation with Assistant Secretary of Defense Robert Karam, and they're thinking of launching a coup to remove Shiites from power and curb Iranian influence in Iraq. And oh, by the way, WhatsApp and Facebook have been very helpful to us in launching some recent political instability and protests. And you can see a little bit of the sample text from here. I fished it out of a translation from Arabic. As you can see, it's not, this is not what an NDU professor would write. This is not what a former NSC person would write. This is not US policy. I think the important context that this is happening in is this is happening, this article is January 1st. And this is coming amidst a lot of domestic unrest in Iraq. You have protests over corruption, which are threatening to, undermine a lot of Iranian influence in Iraq. For the first time, you have protesters, specifically calling on Iran to leave. You have burning consulates, that kind of thing. If you look at what actually happened, our website is fpri.org. You can see it over there on the rack, or you can see over there on the right. You can see the, the formatting with the old sort of sepia map. On the left is where the fake article was hosted, fpri-security.org. Now, if you clicked anywhere on the website, you got a 301 redirect code, and so it would immediately send you to the proper link on fpri.org. Visually speaking, it's very, very convincing. Let's just wrap up the key elements of this fake thing here. You have fake content from real, current, and former U.S. officials. Content includes a U.S. conspiracy to politically disenfranchise Iraqi Shia, hosted a spoof version of a real website, and the narrative is consistent with Iranian foreign policy and pro-Iranian influence in Iraq. Now, what we are reasonably sure is the same activity involved is that this appears very, very similar to a disinformation activity identified by Citizen Lab. Here you can see snippets of the report called Endless Mayfly. And just a word about attribution here is, Endless Mayfly, what Citizen Lab, which is a really great cybersecurity and human rights research organization at the University of Toronto, their report in 2019 identified this as an Iran-aligned activity. The evidence that we have is all based on content and behaviors, and content and behaviors are useful, but they're not technical fingerprints. We don't have a registration for a website saying, Ismail Khani registered this website on May 2nd, that kind of thing. And so that puts us in the realm of circumstantial. We can't say for certain who this is, but what we can say is that these activities are, and these behaviors and the content is very similar to Endless Mayfly. We're sort of borrowing from Citizen Lab's language of Iran Online, is that it appears consistent with Iranian foreign policy. The actors are trying to, push narratives that are very similar to narratives we see Iran push. But we can't actually get to the point where we can say this is Iran or this is from Iran because we have only behavioral and circumstantial evidence so far. But what they found was that, this was an activity that had been running for at least since 2016. 135 articles hosted at 72 domains. As you can see, we'll back it up there on the right there. FPRI is not the only organization targeted as part of this. You can see Belfer Center, Harvard's Belfer Center, they had some, fake interview with a former Mossad official dishing all sorts of dirt on Israel. And that's sort of the Endless Mayfly MO, is that they use typo squatting, which is, a spammer spear phishing trick where you type in a word and you just sort of leave one letter off and visually you skip over it very quickly, but that allows you to register a URL that is visually very similar to the real URL. And the fake domains in Endless Mayfly and the behavior of setting those up is very similar to what we've seen in the FPRI spoof. And what I'll show you in a few minutes is that, these domains are basically, they exist to spoof the real organization. And they have one piece of content on them, which is the one fake article that they have, and everything else is a 301 redirect code. So you click and you get served up your fake article. And if you get a little bit suspicious, or if you just want to browse around, you click on Harvard's research, and it'll all of a sudden redirect you to the real Harvard website research, leaving you in the hopes of the actors behind it none the wiser. And that leads us to what this activity may have been up to recently. So over the past year or so, I've been reporting on a number of Iran-aligned disinformation activity, and we've seen similar behaviors to the kind of Mayfly activity documented in the Citizen Lab report and evidenced in the spoof of the FPRI website, in a host of other examples over the past year. Now, in July, as you may recall, there was a ship fire on board the Bonhomme Richard in San Diego. And what happened is people started, searching around on Twitter, looking for news about what was happening with the Bonhomme Richard. And they found Kelly Turner and Yoni Shebon. Kelly Turner is a fake France 24 reporter. And Yoni Shebon is a very real member of the Knesset, former Israeli Special Forces colonel in the Golani Brigade. But that is not Yoni Shebon's Twitter account. That is a Twitter account that is spoofing Yoni Shebon. And they were both tweeting what we have here on the left, which is a fake letter from Tammy Duckworth, claiming that the governor of California had told her that black separatists within the U.S. military had set the fire on board the Bonhomme Richard, which is, of course, complete nonsense. And this appears to be another incidence of this Iran-aligned actor, Endless Mayfly, spreading disinformation, and we'll get into why. So as you can see here, one of the domains that Kelly Turner and Yoni Shebon were linking to was a spoof version of an Israeli website. There's an Israeli news organization called Petit Hebdo. It's a French language weekly. And what you can see here, this is, I just did a little screen grab of when I first found it, is you can see how the whole redirect process works here, is that You click on, here's the fake article, and let's say I just want to click on the header, and you can see that .org dissolves into .com, redirects me to the real one. And that article, that Le Petit Hebdo article, is a bit of fake news that claims essentially reiterates what's in the letter, but also adds a little bit of interesting context in that it claims that the CIA has assessed that either China or Iran are responsible. And you can see the text here, it's in French. My high school French came in a little bit handy on this one. But the interesting question is, why are they trying, why are they trying to pinpoint, if this is an Iran-aligned actor, why are they trying to pinpoint Iran as a potential source of what would have been an act of terrorism? And I think it's important to look at the context of what was happening as this was going down. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times reported that as this story was playing out, the US and Israel had engaged in a covert sabotage campaign in Iran that saw explosions at an Iranian nuclear facility, but also saw fires at ports in Iran. And it's also pretty interesting that the same day that this story came down, in which some disinformation actor is trying to give Iran credit, so to speak, for the fire on board the Bonhomme Richard, Ismail Khani, the head of the Quds Force, gives a speech in which he essentially tiptoes up to the same thing. And it's interesting to notice what was happening on Persian language Twitter at the same time, is that you had a lot of IRGC links, news outlets and IRGC fanboys tweeting essentially any random fire that had happened in the US and putting mood music over it to the tune of, well, this is potentially sabotage. And, one possible interpretation, and I stress this is one possible interpretation, is that, it appears as though an Iran-aligned actor is trying to give Iran credit for being able to respond to a covert sabotage campaign, at least the impression that it is, because, as the target of that campaign, Iran looks very weak, it looks very vulnerable. But if you launch a disinformation campaign that successfully convinces people that Iran is, striking back at the United States and doing tit for tat, then you get the benefit of having look like you're capable of responding without the actual cost of, what retaliation that would entail. And the Kelly Turner and Yoni Shebon accounts are really valuable sources of other potential Mayfly activity, because over the period of about 2 or 3 months that they were active, they were tweeting out other samples of very interesting Mayfly-like behavior. And here's one of the examples. This is, as you can see, La Provence is an actual French news organization that's legitimate. But this is a great example of typo squatting. La Provence is spelled Laprovence, and you can see that they've removed one of the E's, registered a domain. And in it, they have a fake interview with Elise Ben-Nun, who is Israel's ambassador to France and Monaco, in which she goes off on the MEK and says, the Mossad is supporting the MEK, which is an Iranian dissident group, and providing funds and weapons to them in Iraq with the hope of destabilizing Iran. And as you can tell, as if the typo squatting and redirect behavior wasn't enough to let you know that this is fake. Obviously, Israeli diplomats or diplomats of any country don't exactly go have interviews with random French news outlets spilling secrets about what their intelligence services do. But it is interesting to note that they chose to pay attention to the MEK, because that tends to be a subject that is of interest to, shall we say, a very narrow set of actors. And one of the things that I think you can sort of, grok for yourself here is that there's as the original Citizen Lab report on Endless Mayfly indicated, there's a real interest in spoofing Iranian personalities, Israeli personalities, Israeli news sites. Israel is an overwhelming focus of a lot of Mayfly activity and the subsequent activity, which we believe is Mayfly linked. Here's another example. And this, once again, gets into Iraqi politics. This is Nouvelles Obs, which is, again, a French language news organization. And our friends Kelly Turner, and I believe the Chabon account tweeted this one, but I'd have to double check. But Kelly Turner definitely tweeted this one. And this is your standard conspiracy. Mustafa al-Kazemi, who's new Iraqi leader, who has occasionally rubbed Iran the wrong way, in particular by showing a little bit more willingness to crack down on Iranian-backed militias. This is an article saying that Mustafa al-Kazemi is secretly under the protection of the Saudis. And once again, when we go back to the original Endless Mayfly report from 2019, is that you found Saudi Arabia a disproportionate subject of Mayfly activity. And this is another bit of content that was tweeted out by Kelly Turner. This isn't the sort of domain spoofing that we usually see, but it is interesting to me in terms of narrative similarity to the FPRI spoof. And this is a fake screenshot of a real FOSS24 account. It's a tactic that we've seen other actors use, but it's certainly not exclusive to any one particular actor. Again, this is behavioral, so people can switch things up. And in it, this is as John Bolton was giving his book tour. And so we have this fake screenshot of a real account, and he's saying essentially, in an interview with ABC, Bolton said that there were discussions for a coup to disempower to disenfranchise Iraqi Shia in Iraq, which is a theme that we saw expressed in the FPRI spoof. And more recently, another example of possible Mayfly activity is Israel National News versus .com versus .org. Again, you're playing around with the top-level domains. This one got caught out, and this came in the context of when Iran was sending oil to, or I believe it was refined gasoline to Venezuela. And there was talk of a possible U.S. blockade. And this is, once again, the Mossad director spills all in interview was a theme in some of the Mayfly articles identified by Citizen Lab. And we see the same theme here. And this is, the Mossad director basically saying, well, the U.S. and the CIA are teaming up to launch a coup in Venezuela, which is something that, intelligence directors just love to telegraph in interviews with the press, right? So another fake article, but this one is interesting because, so far, all of this activity that we've documented, it's been alarming to the likes of us, as, Aaron's unpleasant New Year's Day phone call indicates, is that, some actual real people saw this and were convinced of it, at least briefly. But, the consequences of this kind of stuff, it's been relatively low stakes. But if you pull the thread on this particular example of possible Mayfly activity, you start to see, activity and examples that's a little bit more, concerning. So one of the things that the Kelly Turner account amplified, and which the amplification account. So what happens is, just to step back for a second, amplification accounts, it's not enough to just create a fake website, put a redirect code, throw it up on the internet, and hope people just come to it. What you need to do is you need to get this in front of eyeballs. And so that's where the amplification infrastructure comes. You get fake Twitter accounts that pop up, and what they do is they start tweeting this at major news organizations. They will pop into your DMs. I've had, amplification accounts pop into my DMs. I guess I'm on a list somewhere. And what they'll do is they'll say, oh, pay attention to this, or, this kind of thing. And that way, in hopes you get more eyeballs. And so some of the amplification accounts for the Aruch Sheva, that Israel National News article, were hyping this. We also saw the Kelly Turner account hyping this, and this is a verified account in the name of a real World Health Organization assistant director. Dr. Major did not register this account. This is not his account. What happened, and what I subsequently reported at the Daily Beast, was that someone applied for this account in the name of Dr. Major. For those who've been verified, you have to provide a driver's license, you have to provide, relevant activity. And what happened was this operator behind this account applied to Twitter. Twitter pivoted to the World Health Organization and said, hey, can you verify whether or not this is a real account? And the WHO mistakenly said, yep, that looks like him. And that account got verified. And then that account goes on with this racist conspiracy that is recalling the Tuskegee experiment, saying essentially that, the Trump administration is going to test the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine on unsuspecting Black people of Birmingham, prisoner and immigrants. And we're starting to see a theme here, is that the actors behind this Mayfly-like activity are very much interested in using race as a wedge issue and calling on America's very ugly history with race. But this is particularly concerning. I mean, the account lasted here just a few minutes, or probably about a few hours, and it very quickly got attention and it got shut down. But that was part of the plan, because once this account was shut down, the amplification activity starts using that to further the conspiracy narrative. Is that, the first tweet by this fake account was that, oh, something horrible is going to happen to me. I'm going to be murdered. I'm going to be, people are going to call this a fake. And so it's adding credibility to the whole, there's a cover up, there's a conspiracy, people are trying to suppress this. The account was fairly quickly suspended and no one was the wiser. And even real reporters were left wondering, hey, what's going on here? So that's a little bit more concerning to me because it's a verified account, in the midst of a pandemic, in the name of a public health official, seizing on, a public health issue, vaccination that, could have real impact. And what this says to me is that, the points of failure for this to work are, there's at least two big ones. And Twitter and the WHO, you both have to have 2 points of failure on that. And so they lucked out on this, which makes me think that this might not be the only time that they've tried this and probably failed, because this is a high risk in terms of success, whether or not this would actually work. And I'll just end on probably the most disturbing aspect of it is that if you follow the amplification infrastructure for the Israel National News Venezuela conspiracy story, you see a very short-lived account that was dedicated to tweeting that account at news organizations, trying to get them to pick up, trying to get people who were casually coming across legitimate news organizations' Twitter mentions, and hoping that someone would see that article. And you have here that account, the Nargis 012 amplification account. It was tweeting that Venezuela article. Here he's, criticizing Hisham al-Hashimi, who's an expert in Iraqi militant groups, and he was assassinated in early July, and this was just a few days before his assassination, where this account is, essentially criticizing him for criticizing Iranian-backed militia groups. And, that's not to say that, there's any necessary link between this amplification account criticizing Hisham and his assassination. But it comes in the context of what the New York Times and other outlets reported were a lot of threats against Mr. al-Hashimi by Iranian-backed actors in Iraq in the days before his assassination. And so, this is one of the more sort of concerning aspects of this, even if the actors behind this had nothing to do. The climate of intimidation. Now you're getting into something that isn't just a website that is spoofing something. Now you're getting into intimidation and threatening people in real life. And I'll end on that.
Thanks, Adam. And I do want to encourage people to, now that the presentation's over, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and please type it in so that I can relay questions. I had a few right off the bat, so while people collect, one of the ways, particularly about the FPRI spoof, that it was spread was through WhatsApp. And it appears that the intended audience of the FPRI spoof, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on others that you went through, was to use the veneer of foreign language, English or perhaps French, to lend more authority to what was an article that I believe was originally, at least in the FPRI case, was probably originally written in Arabic and translated. So that when people who are redirected to the FPRI spoof see it in English and then are able to read probably what is the original text, it ends a little bit more veneer of legitimacy. So in what sense do you think that the impact may be beyond our ability to track because it's traveling in these circles that we don't entirely see? Perhaps we don't speak the language all that well, certainly in my case when it comes to Arabic, and that it reinforces deeply held conspiracy theories that the U.S. is pulling the strings of Iraqi politics in Iraq, and that they have these sort of sectarian overtones.
Yes, you mentioned the WhatsApp aspect, and that's one of the challenges for cybersecurity, disinformation, you name it online, is that WhatsApp is a bit of a black hole. It's end-to-end encrypted. And so it's very difficult, not just for us, but sometimes for Facebook and WhatsApp themselves, to be able to track that kind of activity. I can't say that the amplification activity that we saw in WhatsApp was intended or caused by the original people behind it. But that's certainly a vector that we've seen the Russians use. And that's, we've seen that disinformation can spread almost as if not more virally on WhatsApp than on Twitter or any other social media platform. We've seen it particularly in South Asia. And we've seen the Russians, our late colleague at the Daily Beast, Chris Dickey, edited a really great piece about how Wagner-aligned groups have been spreading Russian disinformation in Africa on WhatsApp groups. And it's very hard for us to sort of follow that. As to the audiences, I've seen this translated in Arabic and in English on the FPRI thing. I think it was very much intended for a domestic audience, domestic being, I should be more clear, I think that was intended for an Iraqi audience, if only because the nuances of that are so alien to the average American reader. They're talking about, the other part, aside from the whole coup aspect, is they're talking about using WhatsApp and Facebook to stir up trouble. Essentially, is that the context for that article was months and months of protest in Iraq against the existing leadership, against Iranian-backed militias, against Iranian influence in Iraq. And these are things that are just not that front and center in the U.S. mind. A lot of Mayfly activity has been Western, Western focused. But a lot of the times, it's very hard to figure out exactly what they're trying to achieve. But I think in this case, it was certainly trying to reach an Iraqi audience, just because of the language used. And the other thing is that, the amplification that we saw on the FPRI spoof wasn't just on Twitter. There are a lot of sort of smaller fly-by-night Iraqi and Arabic language news outlets that just copy-pasted that in Arabic verbatim. Someone had that ready to go very, very quickly. And so whether or not the intent was necessarily, I can't get inside the heads of the people with perfect clarity who are behind that, but we can certainly say the effect on that one was a lot larger within Iraq and within the community of Iraq watchers than it was on any general Western audience, like they're trying to do with the Bunham Richard fire stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just I heard about it in a very large Iraq WhatsApp group, where a lot of things get thrown around and links posted, in much the way, like an email listserv, but just on your phone. Another follow up to that, one of the questions we have is that, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit, is that, in your analysis of what we're calling Iran-linked disinformation, do you see anything that beyond just think tanks, the Harvard Belfer Center, us, news organizations, and sort of like Iranian-linked cyber attacks or cyber disinformation on U.S. government websites? The question here is about the U.S. Government Publishing Office, the Federal Depository Library Program website, or any, let's say, expanded out to any website that could be affiliated or managed by the U.S. government.
I haven't seen examples of that, but it wouldn't surprise me if they went for that. The point of this isn't necessarily that they're sticking with a strict playbook of this type of news organization, this type of research organization. Pan back, they're looking for sources of authority to convince people. Is that if you look at how this is pulling off disinformation, is that they're not doing what I think most Americans are familiar with when it comes to disinformation, which is Russian hack and leak operations, where you have the GRU breaking into some target of interest, dumping a bunch of materials, and then using sock puppet accounts to amplify, get attention for that, stir up division, that kind of thing. Is that type of operation has a built-in demand because they've got some juicy hack stuff. These guys don't have that. There's no sign that these guys are engaged in offensive cyber behavior. It seemed, I think, Citizen Lab found some examples of malware hosted on domains that were in their Mayfly dataset, but I don't think that there was any indication that they were actively targeting or deploying it. This appears to be mostly disinformation. And so it's a lot harder to get eyeballs on that. And in order to get eyeballs on that, you have to be creative and figure out how to, if you can't make it, then you got to fake it. They're going to fake anything with authority to get eyeballs. And I think that's the MO. So far, we've seen them try and do that with news organizations and research organizations. But there's no indication that's necessarily a hard and fast limit. It wouldn't surprise me if they tried to spoof .gov domains. It's a little bit harder just because, you might try and see, like a lot of the times when people are trying to spoof government websites, they use the US top level domain because a lot of people don't realize that .us is not a government one. So it's certainly not without precedent for spammers, phishers, what have you, to spoof government stuff, and wouldn't surprise me if these guys eventually tried that, but have not seen that so far.
So we got a question from the audience, and I'm going to just read it verbatim because it is, there's been a lot of Iranian IO activity attributed to Iran's state media apparatus, something I know, Adam, that you follow quite closely. Liberty Front Press, UVM networks. The tactic used in Mayfly and the incidents you discussed here have veered from these other campaigns. However, using tactics we commonly see used to support traditional cyber threat activity, spoofing, typo squatting, social engineering to get verified, the things that you went through in your presentation. What are your thoughts on the potential actors behind this? Do you think these tactics indicate a different type of actor with different background, training, that state media employees or something along the lines of state media employees perhaps having their fingers on this?
Good question. So on the, on the let's just back up for a second. Liberty Front Press, with the reference there is, FireEye found a lot of good examples of what were fake news websites that were posing as Western organizations, or not necessarily. Liberty Front Press was a Western-focused one, but there's myriad examples of them trying to pose as North African, Egyptian, you name it. And those we don't have an attribution as to who was behind it, but we have we do have an attribution as to who is behind it. We know that it was Iran, but as can I give you the name of the person operating those websites? That fidelity of attribution we don't have, but we do have a better idea of who's behind them after FireEye came out with their big report, which was pretty groundbreaking. Google came out and said in vaguish terms that the actors behind, so the infrastructure that they saw in similar campaigns was linked to IRIB, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting. IRIB is essentially like their big domestic and international propaganda mothership, and that suggests at least some possible more granular attribution that folks from IRIB could be involved in those, and the activity that was carried out by that group, where it was these fake websites, and those that activity was essentially a lot of redressing up IRIB, like Al-Alam Arabic stuff, which is an IRIB website, and putting it on to different websites, folks at different actual audiences. And that sort of activity seemed like it would make sense for some, if you're working at IRIB, making sort of state news kind of articles, and dressing those up for different audiences around the world. It seems like it's in the same wheelhouse. Very perceptive question. Yes, the activity described here does seem pretty different. Whether or not that indicates a different actor, short answer, important answer, I don't know. Is these guys seem to have slightly better operational security. Not perfect, obviously. Citizen Lab was able to find a lot of these domains because at one point they were just using the same credentials over and over when they were registering websites, and midway through their research they stopped that. So they're, these guys are not bulletproof. They're not the top-notch actors, but they are a little bit more subtle. The Liberty Front Press guys, as recently as a few months ago, they still had websites up that were sharing the same Google Analytics code. These guys are a little bit more quiet. I say these guys, it could be the same people. We don't know. But point is that this is slightly different behavior, slightly different MO than what we've seen from attributed and known documented Iranian disinformation actors outed by FireEye. Whether or not that means that this is necessarily different people behind it, can't say.
Well, let me ask you a more broadly focused question. One of the things that we discussed in the first part of this series with Clint and Rachel Chernowski, who assists Clint on the who manages the FIE program at FPRI, is how government actors are trying to frame the American presidential election. I know you know a lot about Clint's project. One prong of it is the Iranian sort of ecospace and how they are discussing in their English language state news outlets the U.S. campaign and wedge issues. I know that you don't attribute this directly to Iran, but if I were to ask you how these two things broadly fit together, i.e., how in your experience Iran is framing U.S. domestic politics in the campaign, and also how perhaps some of their aligned actors are trying to play on wedge issues. And here I'm thinking about the WHO spoof, or I guess the WHO screw up with the verified account and the amplification of racial tensions in the U.S. How that all fits together. I mean, do you see a coherent pattern, or do you see a whole bunch of disparate pieces that are just trying to cause online, I guess, chaos, for lack of a better term, or do you think it's all part of a bigger picture?
The language that we borrowed from Citizen Lab on Iran Aligned, I think works well here. Is that the Mayfly activity and the carryover activity that we say is very Mayfly-like. It fits with it is very consistent with Iranian foreign policy and similar to a lot of the themes and narratives that we've seen in attributed Iranian disinformation. And one of the things they call out is that we recently had the Director of National Intelligence release a little bit of an assessment about China, Russia, and Iran. The Iran section of that was a lot of it centered on the intentions rather than the activity. But one of the things we know about the 2020 election and Iran's attitude towards Trump is that they're not big fans. And the DNI's office assessed that Iran would and was trying to interfere in the U.S. election. What I haven't seen is very sort of granular American politics style digging in, saying, this gaffe of the week, let's pay attention to this, that kind of stuff. We haven't seen that kind of 2016 IRA style stuff, at least with the data sets that I've seen. Not saying that it's not out there. What we have seen are more general Graphica, which is a really great firm based in London and New York, and they do a lot of work tracking disinformation. They had a really great report on coronavirus stuff, particularly focused on IUVM, which is an actor identified by FireEye as part of their Liberty Front Press general report. And that one we know is an Iranian disinformation site. They've been an Iranian attributed disinformation site, I should say. They've been trying to make a lot of hay out of Trump's handling of the coronavirus stuff. The WHO stuff here that we've seen that is not attributed, but is aligned with Iranian foreign policy, has been trying to make a lot of hay out of the coronavirus stuff. The race aspect that we've seen in the Bonham-Richards stuff, the WHO stuff, is, I should point out, is not a new theme for Iranian disinformation actors. We've seen them try and play on racial issues before, but it has taken on a new prominence, and it is now front and center as an election issue. So I think it would be fair to attribute that as an election adjacent issue that they're seizing on. But most of what we've seen that's U.S. related has been, at least in this Mayfly kind of stuff, has been focused on, to the extent that it's veered into U.S. domestic stuff, it's coronavirus and race.
So, I'm going to ask another question here. It's just, I think a lot of people get, I guess, fall into despair. And I say this because there's so much of this. As I said, this is the third in this series. There's so much of this. FPRI was tangentially touched here, but we were one of many. And the spoof was I think probably unlucky, but largely driven at shaping narratives in a country that most Americans will never go to, unless you're in the military or have some interest in visiting, or some tangent, or have business interests in the oil sector. If I'm being completely honest, Iraq is not a high point on the tourist highway for most Americans. But it helps shape narratives that then have. It helps shape narratives that then have an indirect impact on American foreign policy. and it's also very easy to create. So if I were to put you on the spot and say, what type of, like, not to attribute it, but like, is this, to steal the phrase, a bunch of dudes in the basement just churning out disinformation? Is it that simple? Or is there something, more sophisticated about it, more planning, I guess more policy behind it that would seem to make the barriers to entry, um, I guess, more complicated for than just the average Twitter user? Do you understand what I'm saying there?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, this is not what I would say. This is the activity we've seen here. If we lump everything I've documented over the past year in line with the Citizen Lab stuff, this is not something that is purely in the hands of a state. It is not what you would, this is, when we add up the number of domains, I mean, there's 70, 80 domains, spanning languages, French, Arabic, English, spanning a period of 2016 to the present. That is a lot of activity for one person who's bored on the internet. It's certainly not outside the realm of possible that someone could afford to host and register 70, 80 domains over a period of 4-ish years, but that's an expensive hobby, as sort of casual stuff goes. This is within the capability of I doubt it's one person, because that seems like an incredibly busy hobby for one single person. I think you need to make a distinction when we talk about the impact is, I think the Western focused stuff, and the English language stuff and the French language stuff belongs in a very different category than the Arabic language stuff, because the people behind this kind of stuff and the people behind Iranian disinformation that's attributed generally, they know the audience better, in their near abroad than they do in the United States. Is that a lot of this Western focused stuff is comical stuff that will flop, and will never really get anywhere. But the Arabic language stuff, we've ended on this attacking critics thing. The threatening behavior, even if it's never acted on, is certainly intimidating, because if you can, someone presenting themselves out as aligned with Iranian-backed actors threatening you constantly, is definitely going to have an impact on your thinking, is definitely going to make you sweat a little bit, if you're living in a place where they can reach you. And they certainly have a better feel for the politics. I mean, I guarantee you, if Aaron Stein and Adam Ronsley wanted to set up a Canada-focused disinformation shop, we'd be a lot better at it than, if somebody charged us with interfering and meddling in the politics of Palau, just because, much more similar. We have a lot more experience there. It's easier for us to travel there. We have a better grasp on it. And I think that is when we talk about Iranian disinformation, I think it's fair to say that they have a better grasp and they have a better understanding, and they probably, I can't say for sure, but I would wager that they have a better impact when they're meddling in Arabic language stuff, because that's something that it's a lot more in their wheelhouse.
So I made Clint do the same thing. Again, a lot of people feel like this is never ending, perhaps a feeling of helplessness. No matter what we do, there'll always be the ability to create and amplify fake news, even though I hate that term. But what's the silver lining here? What's the good news? As you've been following this, I know you've been following this stuff for a long time. If we had to take us out on a positive note before I do my regular plug for FPRI, what would you say is a silver lining? Are we getting better at this? Are people becoming more discerning? Are these people really sloppy? Floor is yours for the final comments.
I would say, pull back and focus on the fundamentals. Is that I could be misquoting him here, but I think it's an Adlai Stevenson quote that says, foreign policy is like a river; it never rises higher than its source. And I think that's sort of the silver lining for disinformation. Is that you can try and convince lots of people of lots of things, but it's never going to rise higher than what people were sort of inclined to believe to begin with for different reasons. Meaning that as easy as it is to seize on grievances, seize on different political tendencies through disinformation, and as hard as it is to clean out the Augean stables of fake crap on the internet, there's a real good short way, to shortcut a lot of this stuff is to focus on the fundamentals. Is that, disinformation is a problem. There's lots of things we can do about it. But one of the most effective things to short circuit the impact of disinformation is to address a lot of the reasons that it's effective in the first place. Is, in the same way that the Russians were only effective meddling in the 2016 elections because they were seizing on well-known existing fault lines in American politics. Is there's lots of things we can and need to do in order to address disinformation at the defense level, but just focusing on a better foreign policy can shortcut a lot of this stuff.
Adam, thanks for coming on and going through this. You are, I think you're my second newest fellow at FPRI. There's somebody who came after you, and I know there's more to come from you for FPRI, from everything from Iranian activity in Yemen, in the kinetic space here, actually the use of force in pursuit of their foreign policy goals, and then things like this, which is, I guess you would call it Iranian aligned disinformation, which is also in pursuit, broadly speaking, of Iranian foreign policy, but uses non-kinetic tools and different than the Yemen aspect. So you will see more of Adam's work on the FPRI website, which for those of you, and the very few of you on here who have never been to our website, you should go look at fpri.org. Explore our website, check out our fellows, look at what we publish. I would say all of it is good, some of it is extremely good. And if you are so inclined and moved to support our work, because we really do support both on our members and the work of our staff, to keep the lights on and to continue to host these events, go to check the far right of the page out, and you will see a tab where you can consider joining and becoming an FPRI member, where there are certain benefits that come along with that. So with that, Adam, have a good rest of the day. To everybody who joined, also have a good rest of the day. And as promised, we ended on time. So thank you very much, and have a good day.